Hey, shalom, guys, and welcome to Wisdom in Torah. Tonight, I'm got a very special guest. As you know, I've been really focusing a lot of my studies on the Book of Leviticus for the last forever, better part of 2.5 decades. But I finally made a decision to really focus on that Book of Leviticus, to study the best that I can, to learn how to get a grasp on the offering system and what it takes to be restored to the sacred space. And in doing so, I began to do research on some of the best scholars that I could find alongside with Jewish resources. And I found Jacob Milgram, which is pretty much one of the authorities of the Book of Leviticus, if not the leading authority in the world in his research. And then I also got one of his students who's also a prolific professor in the Book of Leviticus. He's written many volumes in regards to that. And in Leviticus, he also has the Ancient Near Eastern text right here by Illustrated Bible Commentary Zondervan. He wrote the section on Leviticus. He has another one, the IVP Application Bible, I think it is. He wrote Leviticus and Numbers. And he is teaching me at a distance. I keep bugging him and sending him emails. He gives me homework and I do it. And once in a while, he has the time to give me a class on Zoom. And I want to welcome you guys to do that. So I'm presenting it to you as a live here. But in reality, I'm just learning from him. I'm bouncing things that I'm learning because I'm doing massive research on the word ransom in the Bible, forgiveness in this case, like aphesis in Greek. It talks about this stuff and it talks about different things. And now I found one piece of information that I think is important. It's pivotal to understand the work of Yeshua, the Messiah, and really his death and resurrection. And what did that accomplish? And we're going to be talking about that a little bit, exchanging, and I'm going to be learning more. I'm going to be asking questions. So I wanted you guys to be a witness of how I study, who I study with, and how I formulate questions and how I'm learning. So with that being said, welcome, Professor Gane. Thank you for being here today. How are you, sir?
Thank you. I'm doing great, and it's good to be here. Good to chat with you. This sounds like a very interesting topic.
I'm looking forward to it. Listen, I'm doing some research, as you know. I've been bugging you on the emails, and you tell me some things to read. I read them. I do research, and I stumble into a very interesting topic based on what the Messiah Yeshua said. He didn't come to be served. He came to serve and be a ransom for many. And then I found in the Greek, I traced that word, and I found the word lithron or anti-lithron represents a payment for, in the first century, it was the language of a ransom you will pay for a freedom to a slave person. Then Paul talks about how we are slaves to sin. And then Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14 and 15 tells us that Yeshua came to give us freedom from the one who has the authority, which is the devil, and to give us release from our captivity, and that is death. In doing so, chapter 9, I read in chapter 9 of the book of Hebrews, verse 11 to 22, I find all those words involved there. The word for aphesis, which is connected to the Septuagint and the Hebrew jovel. So I know it's going to be a release, a worldwide release in this case for anyone in covenant. The word redemption appears there and is the same one, apolythrosis or lithron. The root is a ransom for slave. So we're slave to sin. But then recently I've been doing the research to talk to you, and I asked the question, what is the one offering that there is no offering? What is the one transgression that there's no offerings in the temple for individually, but collectively as a national repentance on Yom Kippur? Only the high priest can officiate to forgive all levels of sin. Avon PESHA chatat. And that intrigued me because then the book of Hebrews to me is making more sense. And I reached out to you, and you were so nice to be willing to exchange with me to make sure that I'm on the right track, because this will be a very important topic, in my opinion, to teach many people why Yeshua is the Messiah and the perfect work of redemption. So I want to thank you for being here, and I want to get going in regards to the word PESHA. And if you would allow me to ask you that question, then you go as long as you want. PESHA, what I found is that there's no one who commits the sin of PESHA, which is a willful rebellion. There was no sin. The book of Numbers talks about that. There was no offering. Only Yom Kippur as a national, not as individuals, is quite interesting, because the high priest who does everything, which begs the first question. When I read Numbers 18, verse 1, which it says that the priest will bear the guilt of their priesthood, and they will bear the guilt of the tabernacle. Does that mean that they bear the responsibility for the all of Israel in every decision they make?
Mm. Yeah, the priesthood had a very high responsibility, and it was a dangerous job, as you could see from what happened to Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus chapter 10. And so they were the intermediaries with God, and in that sense, they were representing, of course, the nation to God. And so they were responsible for maintaining the security of the sanctuary. It was like a nuclear reactor. When you think about it, God is so great. He's the creator of how many trillion worlds. And yet he comes down here with all that power concentrating into just a small structure, maybe 45 feet long. And so it was not a place to come into like a church. We speak of our churches as sanctuaries often, but not, not in the same sense as that. And so the priests were supposed to make sure, and numbers in several places, about four different places, make sure that it tells you that the Zar HaKarev, the unauthorized person who will encroach on
Uh-huh.
uh, sacred space is to be killed. Okay.
Like Korah trying to encroach on his job.
Yeah, on his job. Yeah, that's right. And so, and Jacob Milgrom wrote on that. That was one of his first publications, was to write on the encroacher and the Levite. But that's to protect the people, really, from the outburst of the Lord's wrath. And it wasn't just that he was nasty, saying, "Okay, you come near me, I'm going to kill you." No, it's to protect from his innate, inherent amazing power. He was concentrating all of that, and they had to really respect what he was. So it was not a matter of intention. You get Uzzah later. Remember, he tried to right the ark when it was on the
Correct.
when David was trying to bring the ark to Jerusalem, and he was killed for doing that. His intention was irrelevant. Whatever mattered. It was just yeah, Adonai was a force. He was a force, and had to be protected. The people had to be protected from that force. And so God gave these rules in order to protect the people out of his love for them. So the priests were responsible in that sense. They were also responsible in another sense. And that is in Leviticus chapter 10, verse 17. It says that Moses says to the sons of Aaron who had survived after the death of Nadab and Abihu, that is Phinehas and Ithamar. And he says to them that you should have eaten the people's hatat sacrifice, that is pure.
Leviticus 10, correct.
Yep. In order to bear the avon. Now, avon is probably best translated culpability or
Uh-huh.
punishability. It's like a guilt that results in punishment to bear that of the people. So they were mediating for the people. So in between Adonai and the people. So in that sense, they're bearing all that responsibility. Now, in the text about the high priest's garments, which is in Exodus 28, it speaks also of the high priest bearing the responsibility for the people. And he bears the gems on his breastplate with
Right.
12 of these gems representing the tribes of Israel. So he bears Israel on his heart. And so this is a very powerful illustration, really, of the coming ministry in heaven of Yeshua, okay, in the book of Hebrews, because
Right.
he heaven and he's functioning as the high priest.
You know what I found um, in Leviticus 10, you just quoted in regards to Moses getting mad at Aaron for not eating that particular korbanot. The I know you study engineerese because you talk about it in your text. Don't you find it quite interesting that that Aaron is actually telling Moses that God is not going to be pleased if he does that based on what happened to him? Could it be possible the reason why he restrained was because of in the temple they were not supposed to have any mourning rituals, and in the state of mourning, although they didn't go through renting undergarments or whatever, that was not allowed. Do you think that maybe they didn't eat it because eating at the time of a mourning and everyone knew that their kids died, and they
Mhm.
used to worship the underworld and the other nations? Do you think that maybe he would have been afraid that they would have thought that he's doing eating to the underworld gods, apotropaic worship?
Oh, I don't know about apotropate worship, but the idea that I get from what Aaron said to Moses was, see, Moses was very upset because he thought here, Nadab and Abihu nearly aborted the whole ritual system, and they were struck dead, and this is a terrible thing. Right at the opening, after all the excitement, 9:24, Leviticus 9:24, the Lord's glory came down, consumed the sacrifices, and all the people were so amazed they fell down. And just a couple of verses later, you have this thing that Nadab and Abihu did. So here now is another ritual mistake by these priests, and Moses is really angry with them. But what Aaron is saying is, hey, brother, younger brother, these are not ordinary circumstances.
Right. That's what he says in verse 19. So
Yeah,
Aaron said
exactly.
to Moses, look, today they presented their sin offering and their burnt offering before the Lord, and
Yeah,
things such as these have happened to me. And
sure.
if I were to eat a sin offering today,
Yeah,
would
yeah,
have been good in the Lord's eyes? I mean, do you think maybe not understanding the culture surrounding Israel would not allow us to see deeper into that text? Because I mean, after all the nations they worship, and you know how easily Israel was influenced by outside forces. I
sure.
mean, it happened with Balaam too.
Right. Well, they were, it sounds to me like an expression of unworthiness. In other words,
That
this,
too.
because Aaron, it was his son, so he feels responsible. He's
Uh,
responsible. They're his helpers. And so because this has come upon my family, my household, then we really are unworthy to take on that mediatorial capacity in this particular case. That's what I get from that. Now,
that would make sense. Yeah,
yeah,
that would make sense.
you're right that mourning was a big deal. For example, in Leviticus chapter 19, the people are forbidden to cut themselves and do various things in mourning. And tattoos may also be involved with that. It appears that they could
Correct.
be in that context.
Yeah.
Because you have, for example, in the Ugaritic epic of Baal, when the high god El hears that his son Baal has been killed by Mot, whose name means death, then um, Ale just rips his chest open. I mean, he takes his fingernails and he
Yeah.
plows it like a field, and all of this gashing, which explains why the priests of Baal were gashing themselves when they were
Exactly.
trying to get the fire to come down because they're trying to do sympathetic magic to jumpstart
You know,
the
you
the
know how
myth.
I you know
Yeah,
how I caught on to that one that is connected to Baal worship is
yeah,
because Elijah does something quite interesting. He puts like a ditch around the altar, 12 stones, and
mhm,
he fills it up with water.
yeah, yeah.
And now, to many people, that makes no sense. But if you study the Ugaritic, you know that Baal supposedly defeated sea, Yam.
Ah, ah.
It's quite interesting because having the water there is like saying, no, it's the God of Israel who controls the waters and the earth. Is fascinating when I start looking more into that
Never thought of
understanding.
that. That's a very interesting idea. And of course, it makes it more difficult it makes the challenge greater. To start a fire with water there, you just don't expect that. But the fact that it lit anyway meant that this is really a great miracle.
For
Yeah.
sure. Let us talk a little bit about um, Pesha, Avon, Chatat. Let's start with Avon first, Chatat, and lastly Pesha, because I really want the audience to understand. And we're not talking about the Olah and the other offerings and the Mincha, because that's not really relevant to what I want to address today. But I really want to. I've been really focusing a lot on the korbanot, the offerings. As you
Yeah.
know, they're very, very much detailed. Oh my gosh, I'm stuck in chapter 2 and 3 for the last 4 months,
Yeah.
and I'm not even to chapter 6 yet. But I'm finding out that once you start learning the connections and the language, you see that language through the whole Bible.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
book of Hebrews is utilizing all temple language. And many people are not really aware of the temple function. So
That's
if
right.
we say Jesus is an offering, which type? Because the lamb was a peace offering. And the lamb was not for collective redemption.
Mhm.
I mean, it has its place. But then the sin that Yeshua forgave, there was, as you know, there was already atonement in the temple. That's something that I've been telling my Christian brothers. Guys, when you use the expression forgiveness of sins, which ones are different intents, as you know? You have Avon, Chata, Pesha. But
Mhm.
when you read chapter 1 through chapter 6 and then chapter 16, you know that there was atonement for those types of sins that defile the tabernacle.
Mhm.
So if the temple would be standing, so there was atonement, but yet there was no atonement or an offering for the one thing that keeps us away from sacred space, which is death, which is that rebellion that occurred in Genesis. And it's
Mhm.
interesting when I looked at that word transgression, Professor, in the first century, that word transgression that is used, 90% of the times that is used, 7 times, is always alluding to the sin of Adam.
Mm.
That's really fascinating to me.
Mm.
So I'm trying to make that connection, and I need your help because in understanding PESHA a little bit more deeply, I'm able to make that connection with that Greek word that represents the equivalent of the Hebrew one for PESHA. Then I'll have a broader perspective of what the message of Hebrews is trying to convey. But if I don't do this, I'm not going to get that over there. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
chatat, when the word says sin sacrifice or sin offering, it can also mean a purification, correct?
Yes, because the Chatat sacrifice was for moral faults in Leviticus chapter 4, verse 1 through 4, verse 13. But then it's also later in Leviticus in chapters 12 and 14 and 15. It's also used for um, physical ritual impurities, as well as in Numbers 19, because the red heifer, the red cow ritual, is called in Numbers 19, verse 9, it's called a chatat. So it is a chatat sacrifice, which is unusual because it's outside the camp, away from the camp, and yet the blood is sprinkled toward the sanctuary, making that connection with it. So this is the only sacrifice that dealt not only with moral faults, that is what we call sins, breaking God's commandments, but it also dealt with physical ritual impurities, which Chiam Maccabee in his book Ritual and Morality properly recognized was these are all symptomatic of the birth to death cycle of mortality
Mm-hmm.
that results from sin. So you have three major kinds of physical ritual impurities. One is contact with the dead. Okay,
Uh-huh.
that's obvious, mortality, right? Another one is scaly skin disease, which is not modern Hansen's disease, which we call leprosy, but it's
Right.
some kind of skin disease. And that also is associated with death because in Numbers chapter 12, when Aaron is trying to intercede with Moses for Miriam, who got this disease, he said, "Don't let her be like one dead." Like a newborn fetus that comes dead from its mother's womb. So that's also a connection with death. But then the intriguing thing is that another major category of these physical ritual impurities is genital flows, male and female, male listed first and female in Leviticus chapter 15, and they can be either unhealthy or healthy genital flows. Why genital flows? Because it has to do with the beginning of life, not death, not the end of it. But this is why Maccabee said the birth to death cycle of mortality. Every new child that comes into the world through human sexual reproduction is mortal as a result of the fall into sin.
Oh,
And
okay. So it,
therefore,
it goes back to that same thing I'm talking about, how death basically what I got you. So the pure that makes more sense now. So you go from the realm, you come into the realm of death. So to become part of the Commonwealth of Israel, you become purified.
that's right. That's right. Coming back from death. So it's like, in Leviticus chapter 14, there are various stages of purity that the person is brought back into the camp. It's almost like a resurrection because
Mhm.
they're outside the camp and they're covering their mouth and they're acting like they're in mourning, and it's like a person who's dead to the community, and yet they're reintegrated into the community, which is a beautiful thing.
It's like the ritual the ritual of incorporation, the rite of passage. When I always tell people when things contain hyssop, that's always a clear cut sign of corpse impurity. It deals with death. It's quite interesting. They use it in the rite of passage for the leper to come in. Also for the on the Exodus, they put the blood on the lintel for the red heifer. It's interesting that it's all connected, and I never really heard about that before. Who is the gentleman that you just said about his book,
Oh, that
Maccabee?
Hyam Maccabee. So it's Hyam is his first name.
Okay, Ian
And
Maccabee.
Maccabee, I got the book sitting on the shelf up here. I could pull it off the
Yeah,
shelf.
after we're done, give it to me so I could because
Yeah,
what you just
good.
said, it really helps me reconcile certain things in regards to the Khatat, because I always wonder, but did they really sin? They're doing something natural, like a seminal discharge or a woman in her menstrual cycle or after giving birth. But now I understand what it means. It comes into the realm of death. So circumcision will work the same way as a sign of a covenant to come into the camp.
Well, circumcision, yes, is a lifelong
Right.
covenant ritual. In terms of the physical ritual impurities, they were symbols of death. Now, interestingly, it's a radical contrast with Egypt. In Egypt, as Milgram points out, every tomb was a temple because they believed in the immortality of the soul, which is not in the Bible at all. That people have sentient existence after death. I mean, it says in Ecclesiastes, the dead don't know anything.
Right.
Um, in Egypt, it was death as a passage to a new kind of life. And so for them, it was not it was not a bad thing. It was holy. Death is holy. But in Israel, death is an intruder. It's bad. It's connected with sin. It wasn't meant to be here and it will not always be here. And so there's a huge contrast in theology between Israelite and Egyptian theology, as signified by this physical ritual impurity system that is saying you've got to keep these impurities away from what is holy. The woman who is has given birth to a child in Leviticus 12, verse 4, I believe it's verse 4, she's not allowed to come into the sanctuary precincts.
Yeah.
In Leviticus 7, 20, and 21, a person who has a physical ritual impurity is forbidden to eat from the holy flesh of a well-being offering, so-called peace offering, shlamim,
Right.
sacrifice. And if they do, they're cut off. It's a very serious penalty. So God was protecting holy space. But the intriguing thing is that that the Chatat sacrifice, the purification offering, God condescended to allow impurity to coexist temporarily with holiness because it's the most holy sacrifice. And yet, in Leviticus chapter 6, 20 and 21 in Hebrew, which in English is 27 and 28, if blood from a Chatat sacrifice sprinkles on a garment,
It's
whether
holy.
the priest or the offerer, they have to wash it off in a holy place. Why? It's because it is carrying a form of defilement from the offerer. I've written about that in my book, Cult and Character. Now, there are scholars who say that it's contagious holiness, but that doesn't work because this rule is not there in the prescriptions for the Asham sacrifice, the so-called guilt offering. And you would expect that. If it's a holy offering, then why not that there too? It's only the purification offering which removes either sin or physical ritual impurity, and there's a transfer to the sacrificial animal from the offerer. So therefore, if the blood sprinkles on a garment, it's got to be washed off. So it's carrying, it's most holy, clearly. It emphasizes that over and over. But then it's carrying this impurity simultaneously, which is telling us Yeshua came down, he's holy for us, and yet at the same time, he condescended to make himself vulnerable to our weakness, to carry our weakness. A very, very powerful message there.
Yeah. So when you have the blood and then it hits the altar, I was trying to figure out. I think it was you when the Colton character or either Gorman, I can't remember, that it talks about. No, it was Wright, David Wright, in Ritual. What's the book? It's the Disposal of Impurity.
Yeah, yeah, right,
David Wright. And it talks about how the animal slaughtered. It's about life, not the death of the animal. It's about the blood of the animal. But
right.
because the blood was shed because of what you did, then maybe I misunderstood. But touching the altar with that blood is that what makes that ransom valid?
Yeah, because in Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11, and some scholars like Milgram have thought that it only applies to the well-being offering, but it's clear from the language there in that passage that it applies to any sacrifice. And it says there that Adonai says, Natati, I've assigned or given the blood on the altar Lechaper al nafshotechem, to
Right,
ransom your lives.
right.
It's the same language used as in Exodus 30, verses 12 to 16, particularly verses 15 to 16, of the half shekel ransoming your lives, if it's in a census. And so it's this means that then instead of you dying, The animal dies. It's clear substitution, as William Gilders has pointed out.
Right. William Gilders, his book is amazing. Um, it's interesting how the half shekel, right? They pay the half shekel when they're in the dispersion, the diaspora. And I always wonder how can that be a ransom? And it makes sense because they actually would buy the communal offerings with that money. So when the communal offerings, the blood was placed on the altar, is actually atoning for the people who actually were counting in. They cannot be counted literally. It has to be through the shekel. It's quite interesting how God makes sure that even if you're in the dispersion, you have a way to receive atonement, even at a distance. It's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, there's another point there that I think that we should bring up, and that is you mentioned that purification offerings um, for physical ritual impurity deal with different kinds of impurities. There were, as David Wright points out, he wrote an article on the spectrum of impurity, and he points out that there are different kinds of impurities. There are permitted impurities, and there are forbidden impurities. And among the permitted ones, we would have to add the automatic ones. Because, for example, male nocturnal emission, a
right.
female menstruation is just automatic. It's a bodily function, has no human volition or choice whatsoever. Then there are permitted impurities. You're allowed to bury your relatives. Unless you're a priest, you can only bury your family members. If you're the high priest, you can't even do that, according to Leviticus 21. There is the permitted impurity of sexual intercourse within marriage. Okay. So that, of course, that's a good thing. Be fruitful and multiply, but it's bringing new mortal life into the world. So this is permitted. Okay. On the other hand, there are forbidden impurities. The priests are not allowed to become impure in certain ways. People are not allowed to become impure in certain ways. And so if a person breaks a rule regarding impurity, that is, incurring a forbidden impurity or not undergoing purification for a permitted impurity, then they are committing a sin. That's not just an impurity at that point. That's a moral fault because it's breaking a command regarding impurity.
Do you think that's connected with Exodus 24 and the indexing of Moses to the altar and the people sprinkling the blood? Because he used hyssop, by the way, on that particular event. And I caught on to that this about 3 weeks ago when I'm going over all my studies. I actually caught on to the fact that he used hyssop
Hmm.
in order to sprinkle the people. And I knew this is interesting because that deals with corpse impurity. So death and the life of the people is connected to the altar.
Yeah, and what he was doing there, he was entering the Israelites into a life and death consequences agreement. Um, as O. Palmer Robertson says in his book, The Christ of the Covenants, it was a sovereignly yeah, it was a blood covenant, sovereignly administered. So it's like a suzerainty treaty where there's the greater party and the lesser
That's
party,
right.
but then the greater party um, has a covenant ritual that the lesser party goes through that makes it a life and death thing. You don't just pull out of this thing
That's
unilaterally.
right.
Okay.
So do
And
you think,
that's why Abraham in Genesis 15, God had him walk between the pieces of these dismembered animals, and that was to signal, well, okay, let's put it this way. Um, he was to dismember these animals, cut them apart. But then the amazing thing in that, you see, is that the ancient Near Eastern protocol was
Mhm,
that the higher party, the suzerain, would have the lesser party go through the pieces as if to say a self uh, conditional curse. If I break this covenant, I will be dismembered like these animals. Okay.
correct.
On this occasion, however, this burning symbol
Torch. Yeah,
of the Lord, the torch, representing the presence of the Lord, Adonai, went through the pieces, which
right.
is stunning. This is the
Do you,
gospel.
I
If
mean,
this covenant
Waynfeld,
is, I will be broken, and there
yeah.
Yeshua is broken in the future. It's amazing.
It's like, I think some of the scholars like Mendenhall, Waynfeld, they all agree, even McCarthy, that falls in the category on the grant. Becomes like a grant covenant, giving the land, the inheritance and descendants to Abraham because God promised that he would. That's basically the whole idea of chapter 15. And I find it's true. It's very unusual because in the ancient suzerain vassal treaties, it was always kings and kings, a lesser and a greater. But here's the divine, it's the deity activating, initiating a covenant, taking all responsibility. So that goes to my question then. If
Yeah.
Israel commits PESHA, which they did, and then you have God going between the pieces in the self curse type thing. In other words, he has to keep the end of the bargain, and he agreed on both sides
Mhm.
about descendants and the inheritance, meaning the land and the people, regardless, they belong to him. They're
Yeah.
cherem. They are now consecrated to God, not for destruction, but for service.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that means that if Israel disobeys the covenant that later was instituted at Mount Sinai, which now includes blessings and curses to live in the land, okay, and to stay in the land. Correct me if I'm wrong. But then if they disobey willfully, rebelliously, and there's no sacrifice for that,
Mhm.
now it makes sense to me why God would give a ransom because Moses wanted to be a ransom for them when they worship the golden calf. He says, blot me out.
Mhm.
But then God says, no, I will do that whomever I want to do that, but I'll forgive them. And that you have the 13 attributes of God, which includes, Pesha. I
Mhm.
find the fact it's starting to make sense to me, but it's not an easy task. But I'm getting it now, and I'm bouncing this off of you so you can help me and correct me and redirect me if I'm going in the wrong direction here, because the whole Pesha thing is blowing me out of the water.
Yeah, well, there's another whole dimension to impurity, and that is moral impurity. And I think we're talking about
Toeva,
email.
correct?
Sorry?
Toeva,
Toiva is one word for it. That's abomination. It's often translated as something that's reprehensible to
yeah,
Adonai. But the people who have written about this, especially are Jonathan Klawans and Jay Sklar and others, and they're pointing out Klawans talks about several characteristics of moral impurity versus physical ritual impurity. Moral impurity that you find especially in the so-called holiness code, the holiness section of Leviticus, starting with chapter 17 or 18, going through chapter 26 or 27, depending upon, scholars have debates about these things. But there you find language of impurity that's used with regard to sins. Okay.
mhm,
So if a person sins, then there's impurity. But what does it affect? It affects the land, the person, of course, but
correct.
the land. And if it builds up on the land too much, according to the curses in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, then the people are exiled. And the language of Leviticus 18 is that if you do like the Canaanites who lived there before, who were vomited out of the land, okay,
Mhm,
vomited out. I mean, it's really disgusting language. Then the land will vomit you out as well.
correct. Yeah, I always find the intriguing when it says, "For the sin of the Amorites have not reached." And I know that they were doing human sacrifice. The Canaanites at one point. There's an archaeological site they found in the late 1800s, early 1900s. I
Yeah,
think it was Gezer. I think it was.
I
I can't
think you're
remember.
right. I'm trying to remember the name of the archaeologist, but I know what
Yeah,
you're talking. Yeah,
and they were doing human sacrifice, and that's the ultimate. Even like the worship of Moloch too, on the southwest corner,
yeah,
outside of the city walls in Jerusalem, in the
yeah.
valley of Hinnom. That's crazy to me how they would do that right there. What an affront to God's authority, you know?
Terrible. Yeah. Now, I think the archaeologist may have been someone by the name of McAllister or something like that.
McAllister, yes sir, you got it, McAllister.
Is British, a British guy, I think.
Yeah,
And now they've also found in the region of Carthage, Punic civilization in North
yeah,
Africa, a
that's
lot of
right.
evidence for human sacrifices. It was
And
just
that's
terrible.
crazy how they would do all that stuff. Let's talk a little bit about avon, iniquity, guilt, and consequence. It's about the sense of to twist something and to bend.
Yeah, yeah, from the root ava,
Right.
of hey. But particularly enlightening about the use of avon in Leviticus, because elsewhere it can just refer to some kind of a sin that people commit. Okay, but in Leviticus 5, verse 1. A person who hears a public adjuration to testify, that is, it's a conditional curse on you if you don't testify, if you have knowledge about some legal case, some crime or whatever. And if you
Correct.
don't speak up, then, and this is called a sin. If a person sins like this, okay, then vanessa avono, he will bear, or she will bear, he will bear his avon. Okay, so this is avon, which is consequential liability that results from an active sin. So it's not just the same as the active sin, it's the consequence, the guilt or the punishability that results from it, which inevitably leads to punishment. And there's a really good article that I think I may have mentioned to you by Baruch Schwartz, my friend in Jerusalem, who wrote the very first essay in the Milgram Memorial volume called Pomegranates and Golden Bells. And it's called The
I
Bearing of
got
Sin
that. I got
in
that
Priestly
book.
Literature. Yeah, The Bearing of Sin in the Priestly Literature. And he points out that this word avon is this consequential liability that a person bears all the way to punishment unless it's taken away by expiation, by removing it,
Mm.
which is what happens if a person then confesses in verse 5 of Leviticus 5, offers a sacrifice in verse 6 or until verse 13, an alternative sacrifice. And then if that happens, then the avon goes to what goes away from them. But of course, the priests bear it if they eat the meat of the sacrifice. So this is,
Wait,
this,
wait, wait. Stop there for a minute. I'm sorry to interrupt you. That's very important though,
yeah.
because I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I didn't mean to do that. But
All right.
the point that you're making is so important because only on two, if I'm wrong, only on two of the offerings is the one when the priests eat it. Am I right on
Only one kind of sacrifice. Oh, okay. Yeah, several sacrifices yes, they eat from
Avon
the
Hashem, right?
yeah, the Hatat and the Asham, they eat certain portions, but also they eat other portions of the well-being offering. And that's in Leviticus chapter 7.
Yeah, well, that's the family eat it. The well-being, the families eat it with them.
Right. And the priest has portions. Of course, the
Right,
priest doesn't have a portion of the Olah, the burnt offering, because the whole thing's burned up to Adonai.
correct. But
Yeah.
Avon, only the priest eat it, not the person who brought it.
Well, yeah, the Hatat and the Asham sacrifice, the person that brought it cannot eat from those.
That's what I'm saying. It's kind of interesting.
Only the priests.
Right.
And
So it goes along with exactly what you're saying in your book, Cult and Cosmos,
cult and
that and character. I'm sorry. I was quoting somebody else's book. And character, in which the holiness of the priest is actually devouring the impurity of the sin from Adam.
yeah, yeah.
I mean that again, they eat of the tree, and then they're eating the lamb in Exodus
Mhm.
to be redeemed, and then Yeshua says, "Hey, this is my body. Eat. It's my flesh." Well, I never really understood it until I'm understanding this. And do you think that that's highlighting Yeshua before he's dying? He's saying, guys, I'm going to be resurrecting into sacred space. That's what I want everybody eating it. Basically, now we're a kingdom of priests. If we're eating and doing the feasts and the holidays, that's especially Passover. That's actually the celebration of victory over death. Like Yeshua says, you shall see me no more, but says this is for your remission of your sin, right? The
Mhm.
word remission is aphesis when he said that in Matthew.
Mhm.
And I find that quite interesting. Forgiveness of sin, for remission of sin. And the whole thing about devouring Isaiah 25:8, that God would devour, would destroy death forever.
Mhm.
We're finding this everywhere. And I find this so peculiar that only in those two that deals with your affront to God, that he is allowing the priest as an active act of restoration. That's fascinating. Tell us more about that particular thing and how it works.
Yeah, okay, so Leviticus 10:17 only applies to the Hatat, the purification offering. It's true that only the priest can also eat of the, I call it reparation offering, or it's often translated guilt offering, the Asham, in Leviticus chapter 5:14 to 6:7 in English, but 5:26 in Hebrew. Okay, so however, it's only in the case of the Hatat sacrifice that the priests bear the avon as a result of that. Okay, so that's transferable only in that case. And the Hatat is unique also in, well, transferring the sin from the offerer to the animal. And then what happens when the priest takes blood from the same animal? That if it came on a garment, sprinkled on a garment, it carries residual defilement to the garment from the offerer. Um, if the blood then, which the priest does, he puts it onto the horns of the altar or applies it otherwise to the altar, and then the fat is applied to the altar. What does that do? That carries some kind of residual defilement from the offerer through the sacrificial animal representing Christ to the sanctuary. And that's why the sanctuary has to be cleansed on Yom Kippur. And that raises a question of theodicy. What theodicy is justification of God's character. Okay, why is it that the sanctuary receives this residual defilement? And the answer that I've discovered is because when Adonai forgives, he bears judicial responsibility for forgiving. When a judge forgives, he bears responsibility for what he's done. That shows up in First Kings 2, for example, with Solomon and the people that are David's last will and testament, and so on. I've written about that also in Cult and Character. But here you have um, Adonai is vindicated on Yom Kippur for having forgiven the right people who are humbling themselves through self-denial, through keeping Shabbat on that particular day. And he's vindicating his having forgiven those people. So this is a really a day of judgment. Yom Kippur is the day of judgment, which shows up in rabbinic literature in, for example, Rosh Hashanah,
Right.
the tractate Rosh Hashanah in the Talmud, that Yom Kippur is a day to distinguish between the loyal and the disloyal, which shows up in Leviticus 16, verse 30, for
Like the
example.
goats and the sheep that Yeshua talked about.
Yeah, exactly. Leviticus chapter 16, verse 30 says that on this day, Kippur expiation, which means removal, is done for you on this day to purify you from all your sins. You shall be clean before Adonai. Then however, in Leviticus 23, 29, and 30, anyone who does not practice self-denial and abstain from work on this day is um, destroyed or cut off. Okay? So here you have got the two classes of people within Israel that are, yeah, Adonai is dividing between these people, making provision, okay, for his vindication of his sanctuary, including from sins that were not didn't ever receive forgiveness. The PESHA sins that you refer to, how did PESHA sins get into the sanctuary? Because only Hatat sins were expiated throughout the year by sacrifices. There's no such expiation for PESHA sins at all.
I, I have a thought. I mean, if Pesha is a direct affront to God, it's Ma'al. They're sinning directly against God, not
Right?
against the sanctity of the temple, more against Him directly, I think.
Yeah.
Would I be correct to say that?
Well, the word ma'al shows up in Leviticus chapter 5,
Correct.
verse 15, and that's the first place. Ma'al really refers to unfaithfulness, or in this context, sacrilege. And there, in this case, it's bishkaga, it's unintentional. And so God is really making a concession, a condescension, even in a case of sacrilege, which is a really important thing. But if you accidentally do this and you don't intend to sin, then you got to offer the most expensive flock animal, which is the ram for an Asham sacrifice. And then even there's a couple more cases of Asham. One, if you don't know what you did in sinning, Leviticus 5, 17 and 19, or if you use Adonai's name in a false oath, and this would be deliberate. He makes a condescension for these cases of Ma'al, which is sacrilege. But Pesha, Pesha doesn't show up anywhere as a thing for which you could have an animal sacrifice. So where did it come from? How did it get into the sanctuary? Well, I think Milgram has put his finger on it, and that is in Leviticus 20, verse 3, you have a person who commits Moloch worship, and it says that the person Timeh, that's PLF, the root Tameh, defiles my sanctuary. And then in Numbers 19, verses 13 and 20, a person that doesn't undergo purification from corpse contamination through the rehydrated ashes of the red cow, that person defiles Adonai's sanctuary. Now, the rabbis and some other modern scholars have said that it's because the individual subsequently goes into the sanctuary precincts. There's no evidence for that. It doesn't make sense. The defilement of the sanctuary is what causes the being cut off. The person is cut off, which means they lose out on their line of descendants, their afterlife, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So they cannot subsequently bring a sacrifice. That's why Milgram's theory of the Khatat fails, and I've written about that too. But the person who does this has committed a very bad sin. They have defiled the sanctuary, not through sacrifice, and that PESHA must be removed on Yom Kippur. But when it's removed, the offender doesn't receive any benefit because they have committed a sin for which they are karet. They're cut
Yeah.
off. The terminal penalty. That's it.
So that means that on the day of Yom HaKippurim, you have the two scapegoats, one for Azazel, the other one for the Lord. That animal for the Lord, none of the meat or the skin or anything is on the altar. Nothing is taken outside the camp, and none of it is eaten. But the blood is taken into the Holy of Holies and is sprinkled in conjunction with the other blood of the bull and the whatever. But do you think that the repentance of the people outside as a nation,
Uh-huh.
then the high priest taking responsibility because he's actually confessing the sins of himself, his family, and the whole nation?
Uh-huh.
And that's when God gives them atonement or a ransom. Basically, the ransom is the life of the blood of that animal.
Yeah. Yeah. So the high priest there is he's confessing while leaning both of his hands, not one hand
Correct.
as usual, on the head of the live goat. Now, the live goat for Azazel, I'll just make a correction here, and that is scapegoat, which is the common term for this goat, is a mistranslation. It's a
Right.
mistranslation. Because in Leviticus 16, verse 10, the goat is sent to Azazel. So if Azazel is from Aiz, which means goat, and Azal, which means go away, therefore scapegoat, then the goat is sent to the goat, and that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So Azazel is simply a personal name, and Jewish tradition, I believe, has it right. It's a demon, and we know who the demon is from the New Testament. Who is the antithesis, the great enemy of God, the enemy of Christ, and that is
Elia.
Satan. He's the source of all of the evil. He's the mastermind behind it. He's the tempter. And so therefore each one of Israel's sins is also a sin of him. And this is not a vicarious thing. It's not a sacrifice. It's an elimination ritual, returning the evil back to him, the punishment back to him. And he's ultimately destroyed. Revelation 20.
Well, okay. So this begs the question then, in regards to that, my whole thesis. The reason I'm asking is that as you lived in Israel when you studied there with Milgram, and I visit Israel for the last 20 years, and I've got the opportunity to talk to Orthodox, and they ask me about my faith, and they always ask me questions. And anti-missionaries, they tell you all the time, well, wait a minute, what do you need Jesus to forgive your sins? There's already atonement in the Bible. And actually, it's true. There was atonement in the Bible, but there was not a solution for death. There
Yeah,
was not a solution. And that's what I'm finding out. That the Bible narrative is basically about one topic. You just said it. It's like all of that is going to end up in Azazel. God is going to render a last judgment in which
yeah,
the ransom of this blood is going to restore sacred space for all of Israel or anyone attached to it. And then the defilement, which is death, is going to be given to Satan. That's how Hebrews 2 is talking about. It makes sense if we look at it from that perspective. Because if we say, would I be correct to say, if we say, well, Jesus forgive all our sins, when there was already atonement in the temple, that's going to create a theological problem. But if we look at the antithesis of life is death, and that God's message through all this ritual, would you agree with me that then the temple is a microcosm of the master plan that God is going to do to restore the macro, which is the whole earth, back to sacred space?
well, that's what the New Testament is saying. In Hebrews chapter 10, it makes clear that why do the animal sacrifices have to be repeated one after another? How can an animal life be equivalent to a human life? It's all tokens pointing forward to the ultimate, truly efficacious sacrifice. Now, those people did receive Kippur, but they received it through faith in the coming sacrifice of Christ. And
Well,
until
that's
that,
what Hebrews 11 talks about.
yeah, sure,
They
sure.
had the hope of the resurrection.
Yeah. And what do you think Moses and Elijah were saying to Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration? One thing I know that they were saying to him is, look, we have been translated. We've gone up to heaven. If you do not go through with this sacrifice, okay, then we will have to come down from heaven and go to the lake of fire.
You,
That's
you
pretty
know,
important encouragement.
uh, it's interesting that correct me if I'm wrong. I'm trying to, as you know, when we say sacrifice, and the word in English doesn't really convey the message as it does in Hebrew. We're talking to an audience that's all they know. But I'm finding it that when I'm talking about Yeshua as a ransom, it's actually it's actually resonating with people once we explain what a ransom is.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
I had the opportunity, Professor, to talk to a friend of mine in Israel who's an Orthodox rabbi.
Uh-huh.
He's an expert scholar on the temple,
Mhm.
and we've been friends for like 6 7 years now. And this time around, I talked to him. I said, "Man, I need your time. I want to throw a few things by you, and we only focus on 1711, Leviticus 1711, and then we talked about the cities of refuge."
Mm.
And I told him, I said, "Let me ask you a question. Can there be a ransom for life in the Bible?" And he didn't think about it. I don't think he really thought about the cities of refuge as a prototype of a ransom by the life of the man, the high priest, who
Uh-huh.
dies,
Well,
frees the person who committed, as you know the story already.
right.
And it's quite interesting because afterwards, after my tour to Israel, he calls me as I'm leaving to get my flight.
Yeah.
And then he goes, "Man, you said a few things I never thought about. What do you believe?" We got this 45-minute conversation, and I presented it this way, ransom and all that stuff. He goes, "Never heard it quite that way before." Because I said to him, "Wasn't Moses a mediator between God and man? Wasn't
Yeah.
him a token of a ransom that he offered himself for the life of everybody?" And God said no at that moment. Doesn't
Mhm.
that establish a precedent? Professor, what's really interesting is the word refuge is found in Hebrews 6:18. And that particular Greek word refuge is only used twice in the New Testament. Once in the book of Acts, in regards to the disciples fleeing, leaving a place. But in Hebrews chapter 6:18 is using it in the context of seeking refuge in Messiah, as if you're seeking refuge from the city of refuge with the high priest. And that's why it's presenting in chapter 5, Yeshua as the high priest. It's
All right.
quite interesting. It's using in my opinion, there's a parallel and a connection between the city of refuge and the writer of Hebrews, connecting that particular narrative to the work of Yeshua to the final ransom.
Well, that's
And
a nice point. That's
I'm
a good
sorry,
point. I like that point. Thank you.
that's
I,
cool. I mean,
I just
that's why I want to talk to you about, because I'm making these connections and I'm thinking, am I going nuts here? But
makes
I'm,
good
I'm
sense to me.
seeing all the elements there, huh?
Yeah, that makes good sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
So
another
understanding ransom, Professor, really helped me out a lot. When last time you explained it to me, that was really, really good.
Yeah, another text that is just blows me away is Daniel 9, verse 26, because there it says that Mashiach is karet, Yikaret
Toros.
Mashiach,
Yeah.
Yikaret Mashiach. It's a nifal of karat, which means to cut off. The Mashiach, the Messiah, is cut off, cut off. That is that is a terminal divine penalty, a punishment in the Torah. Why does that happen to the Messiah? And in fact, Donald Wald, a friend of mine from Texas, he wrote a very important dissertation, 1978, University of California, Berkeley, PhD dissertation under Milgram, titled The Biblical Penalty of Karet. The whole dissertation on that one word. And now he's just come out, it's just come out from Moore Zebek, his published version, updated with a lot of work from the Septuagint added and the ancient Near East, called The Destiny of the Defiant. I actually gave him the title for that. And what he points out is that this karet is not banishment, it's not death, it's something that can be beyond death, because in Leviticus 20, verse 3, a person is already dead from stoning in verse 2, but they also receive karet. So it's a divine penalty that only God can give, ensuring that their line of descendants dies out, and they're not even history. They lose out on their afterlife, which was very important to the Israelites. That's why they had levirate marriage and all that stuff. And so this indicates then that this is like a second death. It's pointing forward to the second death. And so here's Mashiach suffers the second death. Why is that? Well, this is exactly what happened to Jesus. He suffered the equivalent of the second death, although what's different is that he came back from it,
Right.
which
Which is
nobody else does,
the
because he
fulfillment
was
of Isaiah.
righteous.
Yeah.
Yeah. Isaiah 53, he shall see the fruit of the travail of his soul and be satisfied. He'll see the results. He'll see his offspring. His
That's
offspring.
right.
It's exactly what someone loses if they're cut off. They lose their offspring, but he sees his offspring. Why? Because he was innocent doing it on behalf of others.
Now, check this out. You just mentioned Isaiah 53. Now, let me share the screen if I may. And this is extremely important. This is what's going on with the research. Myself, Juan, and one of my friends and my student that were studying this stuff, we're being blown away. As I was looking at this yesterday, I did a search on my logos, and I found I asked the question: how many times is the word PESHA found in the book of Isaiah?
Mm.
Interesting. Well, you just quoted Isaiah 53.
Yeah, yeah.
And check it out. Let me read it in the Hebrew right here. You can read it in the Hebrew because you know more Hebrew than I do.
Uh-huh.
Vehu mecholal mipashain.
Mipashayinu. Yeah, yeah. From our PESHA sins,
Right.
our sins of rebellion. Mhm.
And then verse 8, the same thing too.
Yeah, yeah,
So when the thing is this, that now in rabbinical Judaism, specifically during the Middle Ages, they transferred the understanding, because I have this book right here, which is The Suffering Servant of Israel by Driver and Neubauer.
mm,
That talks about all the quotes from the ancient rabbis about Isaiah 53 in reference to Messiah. And the Targum considers the chapter 52, verse 12 on, that servant, to be the Messiah.
yeah,
The Targum talks about that.
yeah,
And then it says in verse, let me go here real quick. You can help me with this. You see, verse 15, and he shall sprinkle many nations.
yeah,
Now, and you teach on Isaiah, and I called you recently to ask you about this. But what's interesting is that it's talking about he was pierced for our transgressions. And when people look at it and they don't know the seriousness of the word pesha, they
yeah,
don't
yeah,
realize that that cannot possibly be in regards to Israel, because Israel can never, that will be a human sacrifice. And that cannot be. That Israel cannot pay that ransom because of their state. Only Messiah, who's the sent one to do the work. So, and they will crush for the avonot. And
yeah,
then verse 11, verse 8, he was taking the restraint of justice, and he was concerning himself with his generation. For he was cut off, what are you talking about, from the land of the living, and he received a blow because of the pesha, the same thing.
yeah, yeah. Now that
So,
word for cut off there is a different word. That's nigzar. It's not
exactly.
it's not karet. It's a different word. Cut off from the land of living, meaning he was killed. But you're absolutely right. Here you have forgiveness from pesha. Now there is no animal sacrifice for pesha, but there's a very important text that helps explain that discrepancy. Since in Exodus 34:7, it says that Adonai bears pesha, okay, which means that he forgives it, although there's no animal sacrifice for it. And if someone does something which causes automatic defilement of the sanctuary, then they are terminally cut off. But it says in Acts 13:39, a very important verse, Acts 13:39, Paul is speaking, and he says, through this man, that is Yeshua, you can have forgiveness from all the sins for which you couldn't have forgiveness under the law of Moses.
You cannot be justified, correct.
So in a
1339, let me go get it real quick because that's a very important verse.
yep, yep.
I'm going to
So
read from verse 38. Is that okay?
sure,
How much more time I have? I don't want to take too much of your time.
that's right.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. So Acts 13:39.
Let me read 38 real quick.
Good.
Therefore, let it be known to you, men and brothers, that through this one, Yeshua, forgiveness, aphesis, interesting, of sins, there's a release, is proclaimed to you, and from all the things from which you were not able to be justified of the law of Moses. By this one, everyone who believes is justified.
Yep, yep. So
Interesting.
that's very important because that means that the scope, the power of the sacrifice of Yeshua goes beyond that of the type, that is the symbol of the animal sacrifices. And the whole point of the book of Hebrews, over and over again, it says that what we have in Christ and his temple and his sacrifice is all greater. It's greater than. It's an a fortior argument, which in Hebrew is in Hebrew with rabbinic terminology is called kal v'chomer, weak and heavy.
Right.
If
That's right.
so and so, then the more so. So if Christ did, I mean, if the Aaronic priest who was mortal, he was sinful, and all the rest did this, then the more so Christ. If the Aaronic priest had access, the more so Christ has access. You know, not just
It's
on
not
Yom Kippur, but
it's not
anytime.
like it's diminishing the earthly. It's just that it was limited because
That's
what
right.
Yeshua came to do, the earthly time. I mean, Galatians chapter 3, verse 21 says that if there was a commandment that gave life, then righteousness will be of the law, basically. And that's why in Romans chapter 3 and chapter 4, Paul is using the language of Yom Kippur. You know that because Yeshua is like a mercy seat. So I got a question, and my last thought. I know I don't want to take too much of your time. You've been very kind to me. Um, I have a theory, and I want to run it by you because I've always wondered how can it be a new covenant? Well, uh, can I submit to you something that I'm thinking about the new covenant and the ways described in the Book of Hebrews?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Is that the way that it was done? The blood of Messiah is renewing the relationship with God and humanity, and it's allowing all the nations to be part of it because of Abraham. You know, the whole walking between the pieces, and in you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And then
Mhm.
Messiah will sprinkle all the nations. Sprinkle what? It has to be the waters of purification. Ezekiel 36. That's the paraduma for corpse impurity. Could it be possible that when it referenced new covenant in that sense, it's talking about the way that God is restoring humanity? Uh, because the earthly offerings could not take care of the problem of death. It's
Mhm.
not really minimizing this one on the earth. It's just it was for sacred space, purification, relationship. But this one is for all of humanity to be returned.
Yeah, yeah. The scope's much greater. The power's much greater. Well, in Jeremiah 31 to 34, which is the Brit Hadashah passage, the New Covenant, from which we get New Testament, that passage makes it very clear that the Old Covenant, which has to be replaced by the New Covenant, the Old Covenant was the covenant that they broke. In other words, it was defective, not because God don't make no junk, right? He didn't make a bad defective covenant, but it takes two to tango, as you could say, and two to have a relationship. And they broke the covenant. Therefore, there needs to be a new covenant. What does that really mean? It means a renewed covenant.
Well,
It's
that's
really
right.
the same covenant that he originally gave, and
Right.
it's just renewed because they broke it, but now he's restoring it.
Well,
Just like after the sin of the golden calf in Exodus
right.
34, 32, he renews the covenant in 34.
Well, he renewed it when there was a covenantal renewal when Moses gave the Torah before he died.
Yeah.
In
Another one.
Deuteronomy, there was a covenantal renewal when Joshua passed away, and
Yeah.
Yeshua did a covenantal renewal when the last when the on the last Passover that he had. So
Sure.
it all lines up with covenantal renewal. Um, Professor, I think you're answering my questions. PESHA is a very big topic. Clearly, we cannot cover it in one day, but I get a sense that I'm going on the right path here. So, any suggestions that you think I should look into to continue to stay on the right path here? Because I don't want to speculate too much, but it's
Sure.
starting to make a lot more sense.
Yes. Well, the verb pasha from the same root means to rebel, as when King Mesha of Moab rebelled against his Israelite overlord. And it's very clear that that is severing a relationship. Now, Rolf Knierim has written in his book Hauptbegriff für Sünde im Alten Testament. That's chief terms for sin in the Old Testament. That's one of the main authoritative works. But you can read in English Knierim's articles in the Theological Lexicon of the Old Testament. It's a um, three volume theological lexicon, like a theological dictionary. And Knierim wrote the words the articles in those three volumes on the terms for sin, avon, pesha, chatat, and so on and so forth. He wrote those, and it's very helpful. So he points out that really pesha is a breach of a relationship. Like, for example, in Exodus 22, I think it's verse 8, where an Israelite, if he pashas against another Israelite, and this would be regarding something economic, then there has to be some remedy that goes for that. Okay, so that's
Compensation, yeah.
yeah, not such a serious case, but then when you read in the Torah about pesha against Adonai, then it's a much more serious thing.
Like a treason, right?
Yeah, I think it's Exodus 23:21, where he says that if no, it uses a different word there, mara. I think it parallels it may parallel pesha with mara, which is a word for rebel, and so because God is the superior. So if you break your relationship with Him, it's not just like with another Israelite.
Right.
It's you're casting off allegiance to Him. And in Numbers chapter 15, 30, and 31, it uses the expression sinning with a high hand. Yad
Right.
Ramah, okay,
Yeah.
which is defiance. And in Numbers 14, Moses refers to the Israelites leaving Egypt with a high hand, that is against Pharaoh. They're saying, I'm done with you. I'm not going to follow you. You're not my leader anymore. I'm not going to be under your rule. And if someone does that, then to Adonai, if they're an Israelite, then they're cut off. That's it. No sacrifice is available for them. So this is a very serious, Pesha is a serious thing. I think it can be shown that not only the verb, but also the noun refers to rebellion. Now, some of my colleagues and scholars that I debate with try to argue that it's something less than rebellion and that it could be expiated by the chatat sacrifice, but there's just no evidence for that. And the so you shouldn't just assume that because pasha means rebel in the verb that it has to mean that in the noun. That's something that James Barr, in his book, The Semantics of Biblical Language, 1961, he pointed that out as root fallacy. You can't just assume that another word from the same root has the same kind of meaning. Everything is defined by the context. But
Correct.
I discovered that the context bears it out, that when you have the noun pesha, in relation to the divine human relationship, it really refers to rebellion, rupture of that relationship. And so the only two verses where Pesha shows up in all of Pentateuchal ritual law is in Leviticus 16:16 and 21, where it's removed from the sanctuary in verse 16, from the camp in 21. And so it seems to fit with the profile of this automatic defilement. Leviticus 20, verse 3, Numbers 19, 13, and 20, where if a person uh, does a really serious sin, that is, it's rebelling against Adonai, therefore it defiles the sanctuary, and therefore defilement from that must be removed on Yom Kippur, signifying that Adonai condemns that person, he distances himself from that. And here's an illustration of that. Um, you may remember, maybe you're too young, the Iran-Contra hearings.
Oh, I
Do you remember
remember that. I remember
Colonel
that.
Colonel
I'm
Oliver
glad I
North?
look young. I'm 59, so I remember that.
Okay, and I'm turning 70 in a few days, if you can imagine. Um,
Happy
so
birthday.
Colonel Oliver North was illegally, without the authorization of Congress, he was selling arms to Iran, using the money to support the Contras in Central America. When it was discovered, then the question was, what did Reagan, the president, know, and when did he know it? Because North was operating under his administration. Okay, so then there was this trial before Congress and everything like that, the Iran-Contra hearings. Okay, so how is it that Oliver North affected Reagan? It was just by what he did, because of the fact that he was working under Reagan's administration. Similarly, whatever an Israelite did under the umbrella of the covenant, that had Adonai as its king, then whatever he did or she did affected
Yeah.
um, the relationship, and automatically affected the sanctuary from a distance, which is symbolizing affecting Adonai's reputation.
Well, that's what that's what Exodus 24 is really about.
Yeah,
Connecting through blood, connecting the altar and the people.
yeah. So just as Reagan had to try to distance himself from Oliver North, so Adonai distanced himself from people who did that, saying that's not representing me in the world, because the representation of Adonai is crucial for him to draw other people to him, his grace, his covenant. As Jesus says in John 12, verse 32, if I be lifted up, will draw all people to myself. And so he doesn't want to deal with misrepresentation of him and his character, because it's his character of love. God is love that draws people to himself.
So with all this, now the whole book of Leviticus, the whole book of Hebrews, which I think you and I would agree is somewhere written right before or right after the temple destruction. And I always found it quite interesting that the neither Yeshua or anybody of the disciples or the apostles ever called Yeshua a high priest. Um, Yeshua never called himself a high priest. And I think, my opinion, I believe now that the writer of the Hebrews is basically using the narrative of Numbers 35 and the plan of ransom, utilizing all the language of what's going on. Death being the premise of that removal of death is the original sin from Adam, that led that rebellion that affected a lot of humanity. which Paul is talking about in Romans chapter 3 all the way to chapter 8.
Mhm.
1 Corinthians 15 about resurrection is about death being defeated. And then chapter 21 of the book of Revelation, it talks about death will be no more, which, by the way, after the millennial reign, it doesn't mention a temple. So therefore, I'm starting to understand that really the story of the Bible is only one. It's how God is going to defeat death through the ransom that he provided of the life and then ratified by the blood of Messiah, like the Bible clearly says. But if I did not understand PESHA, I don't think I really would have understood in deeper the dimension of the work of redemption through Yeshua, the Messiah. It's quite amazing. And I hope I'm on the right track. And I want to thank you for allowing me to bounce this stuff off of you. And please tell me when I'm wrong in something, because I want to get better, and I will correct it and rectify it if I have to.
PESHA reminds me of this is really a very the most serious word for sin. Okay,
Right.
words for sin, but it's a really serious one. And it reminds me of something that somebody said, some author said, and that is, we see by the length of the chain let down to bring us up how far we've fallen. Say,
Yeah.
and PESHA shows how far we've fallen, and then the length of the chain is God's only Son. I mean, it's just an infinite sacrifice. Now, do you know there's a book that's really important in all of this, and that is David Moffat has recently come out with a book called Rethinking the Atonement, in which he's looking at the book of Hebrews as you're doing through the lens of the background in Leviticus, which is the way to look at Hebrews, because that's the writer of Hebrews is saturated. The book is saturated with Leviticus kind of language.
Right.
And so that's how it makes sense. And what he's showing is something that many Christians, many evangelicals have not understood, and that is that atonement does not end with the cross. Okay. And as I said in my book, Altar Call, which is now published as The Sanctuary and Salvation, the atonement begins at the cross. It flows from the cross. That provision is made for all atonement at the cross. But atonement at one-ment is reconciliation. And
Right.
it has to include forgiveness of me. And I started sinning in 1956. I was born in 55. My
Right.
first sin was in 56. I know what it was. Um, and so that means that Christ's atonement includes his mediation as a priest that applies his blood to my case. And David Moffat has pointed out on the basis of Leviticus, including especially my book, Cult and Character, and that of other Leviticus scholars, that the priestly mediation is part of the sacrifice. It
So
continues that work of atonement. And that's what he does in heaven after he ascends after his death.
correct. It's only once and for all. So I mean, this is a permanent one,
Yeah.
which is the foundation for the resurrection. Absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating how much we really do not know about the Bible that we're completely learning. We're really searching and learning. I hope that I do a good job trying to find all these little threads that we're finding. One more quick question I need to ask you. I'm doing some research on the expression "jukatolam" because there's a big argument in the Spanish world among certain people. They're not Hebrew scholars, by the way, but
Uh-huh.
they think they are, and they're assuming that the word olam, which is true actually, halot and the Vidag talks about the word olam by itself in certain places, doesn't necessarily all the time can mean eternal. But what I found, and maybe you can help me correct this, is when it uses the word hukatolam in combination.
Uh-huh.
In one of your books, you quoted it. It's more of the legal aspect of it. The 16 times that is connected, the expression hukatolam is actually dealing with the kedusha of the things in the temple and the priesthood and the feast and all things like that.
Uh-huh.
With that being said, when we talk about uh, the sons of Aaron being priests, if there was a temple, according to the commandment and the gift that God gave them in the book of Numbers, chapter 18, they will have the right. And that's why the book of Hebrews says that if Yeshua was on earth, he would not be a priest, for they're already priests according to the law. Um, do you think that maybe not understanding the expression chukat olam as something legal maybe creates a discrepancy in the understanding of the people of the work of Yeshua as a high priest in the heavenly tabernacle, and dealing with the quandary of the book of Ezekiel as is leading to the assumption that there will be a restoration of offerings in the earthly realm when Messiah returns?
Mm.
Because what Yeshua did had nothing to do with what the temple can provide. Am I on the right track here?
Well, it's interesting. In Isaiah 66, at the very end, it talks about how God will take priests and Levites from among the Gentiles. And that's looking forward to an ideal future. The word olam really refers to permanent, but within its context. Now, the book of Hebrews makes very clear that the Melchizedek priesthood of Christ, King of righteousness, is greater and supersedes that of the Aaronic priests.
Hmm.
And so olam doesn't mean in an absolute sense, just as in Greek, the word aion or aion
Yeah.
ton aion, of the ages, which is often translated eternity, um, is is conditional. It's referring to as long as the nature of the subject allows. For example, the wicked are burned with eternal fire. Okay, does that mean that they're suffering on, as in a lot of Christian theology, um, for eternal torment? No, no, it doesn't. It means until they're burned up.
Yeah.
And there's a book on that called The Fire That Consumes by Edward Fudge, an evangelical who used to believe in eternal torment, but he found in the Bible that's not what it means. I mean,
Right.
for example, in the book of Jude, it says that Sodom and Gomorrah were burned with eternal fire. Okay. Now, I've been to that region. I've been to the site that archaeologists think may have been Sodom. It's called Bavithra.
Hmm.
And
Right.
there was not a fire burning there. It was as hot as
Yeah. There's
It was
fire,
a
but
really
not a
hot
fire
day.
there.
Yeah, but there was not a fire that's burning there. It just simply means they were totally burned up, and that means that the those who do not accept, those who rebel, ultimately rebel against Yeshua and His grace, they spurn the free gift that He's giving, are going to then be ultimately burned up. The universe is going to be clean from rebellion against God's law of love.
Right.
So this Hukat Olam um, would be referring to within the framework of this system, it's permanent, you know, until, of course, it's superseded.
Well, I mean, we do know that after the Messianic age, after the 1,000 millennial reign, it doesn't really mention a temple. I think that we're going to go back to Eden again, like where God Himself will dwell on the earth. There's no death. That's why He can come back on the earth.
Yeah.
Uh, I have some questions that I'd like to ask you much, much later about this particular topic. Maybe that's something with time. If you have time, we can discuss it.
Sure.
Um, I think it'll be fun.
Yes, absolutely. I love talking to you because you have such um, a free-flowing mind. I mean, you're looking creatively at different things, connections between them, and all this, and I really like the way you think. It's
Thank you.
fascinating.
Thank you.
Discuss.
That means a lot to me. I'm working very hard. I have a lot of help. And I really want to, I have a big responsibility. I study a lot because I want to do the right thing. And I
Yeah,
don't mind changing. I don't mind adapting. I don't mind rectifying things. But I want to just make sure that whatever I present something, that I'm not misleading anybody. I want to have the ethic. Well, we represent God. I mean, we want to do the right
yeah.
thing for Him. So I want to thank you for giving me your time and for sharing what you know. I mean, the whole only three of them. We spent all this time, and it's very in depth, and people have no idea. And I wish people would look into these things because then now to me the Book of Hebrews makes a lot more sense. Would you
Yeah.
agree, lastly, that the main topic of the Book of Hebrews is basically how God, through the ransom Yeshua, God through His Son Yeshua, now He's going to eliminate that PESHA, that transgression that created a rift between not only Israel and God, but also humanity and God, because it's a twofold type thing. He wants to restore the cosmos, for God so loved the cosmos.
Mhm.
It's not just Israel. He made a promise to Abraham, but he also said to Abraham, and in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And I find this so amazing how everything is working together in a perfect plan and starting to gel.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and then it's awesome that in the book of Hebrews, it makes it very clear Christ is represented by the sacrificial victim and also by the priest. And the combination of those two things proves substitution
mhm,
because the priest bore the avon, right? Leviticus 10:17, right?
yeah,
Priest did not have to die for that avon. The high priest only dies naturally, and then the person in the city of refuge is released at that point. But the priest didn't have to die for that sin. But Yeshua does die for that sin as the victim because he has two roles. He has the role not only the priest as the victim, so he bears my sin and then he dies for that sin as the ransom.
So
Um,
he becomes the ransom, and he also becomes. I got you. He does the function and the role.
yeah.
Got it. All right. Next time we get together, I'd like to talk to you about uh, can Yeshua do the priesthood on the earth? But we'll leave that for the next time. Okay.
Okay. All
All
right.
right, I
Sounds
think
good.
it'll be fun. So I want to thank every single one of you for coming and joining us today. Remember, when you are in the YouTube page, hit the share, like, and also subscribe to my YouTube channel. And also, you can look up Professor Gaines' book. He's very well known. So look him up on Amazon. You can buy his books. It's definitely worth the reading. And I liked the books before when I read, but I like the person even more. So I'm going to continue to read his stuff. And lastly, Professor, anyone wants to get in touch with you, where can they get your information, your books, or whatever? I don't know what you're doing, so I don't want to assume that you're going to be able to get in touch with people. But if anyone wants to ask you a question, is that something that you want, or you're able to allow someone to do?
Well, yeah, you can. Of course, I'm teaching full time and writing, doing a lot of research, so I'm a bit limited. But if you have a brief question, succinct, concise question, you can just email me at Gane. That's lowercase Gane. That's N as in Nancy. Well, I guess you can see my name up there, Gane.
Yeah.
Gane, lowercase at Andrews. That's the university. Andrews dot edu. So gain at andrews.edu. Um, and I can do the best I can. I get questions from really literally all over the world.
Okay.
And I do the best to answer them when I can. But that's a possibility. Yeah.
All right.
Of course, my books answer many of these things, and I might refer you to some place in my publications. Yeah.
That's great. Well, I mean, guys, please get the books. Very important. He also studied with Jacob Milgram. Not everybody can say that. And I'm honored to have access to some of the best resource on the Book of Leviticus, as you heard him today. Obviously, he knows his stuff, and I'm learning a lot. So I'm looking forward to, for the next 10 years. I made up my mind that I just want to focus on Leviticus. I want to be able to, hopefully, I've been doing it for a long time, but I want to focus on Leviticus. And I'm hoping that you and I will get to know each other more and that I can continue to learn more from you, Professor. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Shalom to you.
Shalom.